Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Daniel Chu. I'm Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center on International Security that houses the Atlantic Council's work on cybersecurity. And I'd also like to thank those who are watching online, the webcast of this event. I encourage you to join the conversation, including if you'd like to submit online questions, and obviously we'll be taking questions from the audience as well, via Twitter using the hashtag ACCyber, at AC Scowcroft, and at CSM passcode. This afternoon's conversation on online communities and the future of national security is part of our monthly Cyber Risk Wednesdays speaker series. Most of you will probably have noticed, even if I haven't, that today is not Wednesday, so today we're going to call it Cyber Risk Thursday series. This series is designed to convene cyber experts from various sectors to examine topics at the core of the Council's Cyber Statecraft initiative. And today we've gathered a group of well-known experts in countering violent extremism and cybersecurity to discuss the great opportunities and potentially grave national security challenges posed by disruptive technologies and self-regulating online communities. Thank you to Charlie Snyder, Jasmine Elgamal, who's hiding back there somewhere. There she is. Hi. And Leo Blanken for taking time to join us. And Deputy Director of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative, Bo Woods, will be moderating the discussion. Also want to thank, of course, our media partner for this entire series, which is usually on Wednesdays, Passcode, the Christian Science Monitor's new guide to security and privacy. You know, it wasn't that long ago, at least for some of us, that we talked about all the incredible good that we thought internet connectivity was going to do for people in terms of providing access to information, providing diversity and plethora of views, balance, and objectivity of opinions. Since then, we've heard a lot more discussion about the challenges and threats and vulnerabilities that exist in cyberspace. Everything from things that seem benign, like polarization of opinions that lead to narrowing of opinions rather than diversity of views, to malign uses of internet and information connectivity that can then really help overwhelm the good forces in internet connectivity and create risks, significant risks to national security. Such technologies have enabled the so-called good guys, including security researchers, hobbyists, innovators, but at the same time, the tools and services are equally accessible to the bad guys, hacktivists and terrorist groups. So today, what we really want to discuss are the overwhelming number of good actors in these online communities that can be creatively mobilized to combat the bad activities in their midst. So before I turn it over to Bo, as I said, who will moderate our discussion, to kick off the panel discussion, we will hear some opening remarks from Charlie Snyder. Mr. Snyder serves as Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, my old stomping grounds, at the U.S. Department of Defense, where he develops cyber policies, strategies, and plans which guide the department's efforts in cyberspace. Charlie has also served in multiple positions at the department, including working for the first principal cyber advisor to the Secretary of Defense and serving as the department's principal liaison to Congress for all cyber issues. He was also critically involved in the Hack the Pentagon initiative that was launched by the DoD last fall and very recently concluded. It was the first of its kind bug bounty contest, invited vetted hackers to test the security of DoD web pages and crucial networks. I'm very excited to hear about the department's experiences on this front, and with that, Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Atlantic Council, for hosting this event. Super excited to be here. So again, my name's Charlie. I work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, specifically in the Cyber Policy Office. We tend to wrestle with very weighty issues there, like deterrence and international norms of behavior in cyberspace. But some of the most meaningful and interesting and definitely fun work I get to do in this job is engaging the hacker community. So that's what I'll talk about for the next few minutes. So I'll talk about how we've worked with that community, what the benefits are for DoD, why we wanted to get into that business, and how that kind of culminated in Hack the Pentagon, where we ultimately invited 1,400 people from that community to hack us, and if they found anything interesting, interesting vulnerabilities, we'd actually pay them for it. So first, because it sounds a little unusual and scary, I figured I would cover, why DoD wants to do this, what's the benefit for us. And it kind of starts with two kind of facts that we can't shy away from. The first is that, the bad guys are not waiting for an invitation to do this. They're doing it already every single day. So we need to try to find ways to level the playing field and clear out the obstacles to let the good guys help us. The second piece is that DoD is really big. We have tens of thousands of networks and systems, each running applications and services that are growing more and more complex every single year. And it's really hard, despite our large budget and our 3 million employees, to put together the resources and the people to give every corner of what we call the DoDIN, the DoD Information Network, the attention that it deserves. So if we can find ways to enlist, the power and the talents of the crowd, so to speak, hackers, all over the country, potentially all over the world, we can help kind of offset some of that strain on the network defenders that we have at DoD. But there's a major qualitative advantage too in what you're getting. It's not just about the amount of people. And the qualitative advantage also is not just about the skill level, though a lot of these hackers are highly skilled. For me, it's mainly about kind of the diversity you get. So DoD, we will train our operators and our red teams through kind of a standard training pipeline, a couple different pipelines. And what comes out on the other end is certainly very skilled, but it's, this is our DoD approach. And when you open it up to the world, you open it up to different experiences, expertise, perspectives. When you have all these different people from all walks of life, you're going to get really diverse and interesting results. So that was another big advantage for engaging the crowd, the hacker community. And also there's kind of macro forces we're very interested in. So shifting kind of the dynamics in the marketplace for vulnerabilities and exploits. If we can provide more legal avenues and provide them at scale for hackers to employ their talents to help the organizations that they're hacking, hopefully over a long enough timeline that'll start to dry up some of the black market for exploits. So as we started doing this, we obviously needed to rely on experts. And really critical were kind of ambassadors to the community, people that could bridge the gap between government and hackers. Bo is certainly kind of a professional ambassador in that role. Another major factor or person for us was Katie Masouras, who's sitting here, who is kind of central to our thinking in this and setting up this program. She founded Microsoft's Bug Bounty, and she had been kind of pitching these types of concepts to us for probably a couple years. My colleague in setting up this program, Lisa Wiswell from the Defense Digital Service, which was the organization that actually hosted this effort, also had a lot of ties to the hacker community that we were able to leverage. And so we knew from talking with these guys that they would help if we could just clear out some of the obstacles and give them a legal method to do so. Setting out on this, we had kind of one principle in mind, that DoD, and in my opinion, the government should not think of themselves as special or different from what people in the private sector are doing. So techniques that work for the private sector really should work for us. And the private sector already has a lot of these crowdsourced techniques figured out. Both bug bounties and other interesting applications. Companies like tech companies like Google and Microsoft and Twitter are obviously leaders, but also kind of more conventional Fortune 100 companies like GM and Johnson & Johnson are also getting into this game. So, but we had to make DoD a little more comfortable first, and did a lot of outreach, and we worked with stakeholders from across the department to get comfortable. I think a lot of people are nervous about working with a community that they might not have a lot of experience about. And so we were very conscientious in doing the work to get everybody on board. And I kind of joke about the extreme amount of billable hours that our awesome legal team put into every single word of the contract that we put together with our contractor for this, HackerOne, who hosted the platform, with the rules of engagement that we presented the hackers with to tell them left and right limits, and various other documents. And at the end of the day, I think what brought everyone on board was that first point I started with, which is that the bad guys are not waiting for an invitation. So all this is providing an avenue for the good guys to help out. So again, we ended up inviting about 1,400 people into the program, and they hacked on on 5 different websites. And the secretary recently closed the program a couple weeks ago, and we were pretty pleased with the results. Both the amount of vulnerabilities, but also that kind of diversity I talked about. Just really interesting results that your automated tools may not find, and that kind of your traditional net defenders and penetration testers, red teams, they might find some of them, but when you bring in high schoolers and people from all different walks of life, you're just going to find different stuff. I do want to touch on kind of the personal dimension of these communities coming together, because I think there's definitely a sense, at least, that government and the hacker community are kind of at odds. And I think part of the reason that's difficult is they kind of view it in an abstract. This community is kind of an amorphous and vaguely nefarious blob of people that we don't know. So we also wanted to try to put a human face on what we, the government, were doing. So we went down to Infiltrate, which is an offensive, security-minded conference, and we personally recruited people. We made these little business cards that said, "Come hack us, sign up here," and hopefully kind of defuse some of the skepticism that some in the community might have had about who we were and what our intentions were. And on the government side, I think it was really good for people to see once the pilot got started. The actual people behind the keyboards doing this. So they would submit a report, and there would be a lot of back and forth between our contractor and the hackers, trying to validate a vulnerability, see what's real, what's not, how serious is this, is it closed or not, did we fix it? And though there were sensitive situations we would run into, every single one of them was diffused because hackers are just like us. They have the same motivations. They were acting out of patriotism, for financial incentives, because it was an interesting challenge. And everyone, on both sides of the equation really wanted it to go smoothly. So I think that was really good for people on the government side to see, and will really help in the future. So when the secretary closed out the program, he announced, this was successful and we want to keep it going. So we first are very interested in kind of sharing these lessons with other parts of the government and other governments. Again, some of these kind of macro level forces are only going to be successful if more people take them up. We obviously are very interested in expanding the use of bug bounties at DoD, so we're working on that. And we also want to develop kind of a portal or a key point of contact for the community that if you, a researcher, know about a vulnerability in any type of DoD network, we actually do want to hear from you. We don't want to be this, imposing, unreachable edifice. We want a front door where we can communicate with you and we can follow up with stuff you've reported to us. So we're pretty excited about the future and about expanding this collaboration with the community, and I look forward to the discussion.
Head on up. Welcome. I think we're gonna make a last-minute addition to the panel. We're gonna ask Katie Mazuris, since she's in the room, to come on up, since she's had a lot to do with obviously bug bounty programs, other coordinated vulnerability research, and has a track record with Charlie as well as the hacker community. Yeah, you can stand, or we can slide a chair in for you right there. But we're always happy to add another voice to the conversation.
Now I get to defer all questions to you.
Yes. Okay. Do you want to sit here?
Sure.
Right up next to me.
All right, then.
So speaking of adding other voices to the conversation, as Dan mentioned in the intro, we have a hashtag ACCyber on Twitter. If you want to ask questions, we'll try and get to some of those during our Q&A session at the end of this. So this topic came about, the self-regulating communities and how can government in particular engage with some of these communities of interest. From some conversations that I had with Leo that led eventually to a workshop out at Stanford where we brought in people from many different walks of life to talk about this. And it really opened my eyes to the possibilities of what could be done with government and other regulatory or oversight type of engagement with some of these people who maybe are normally a little bit allergic to that type of engagement. I think that there are some track records that we can point to that say that this might be a successful governance model, which would be really, really neat to find something like that. So I want to start and turn it over to Leo to give a couple of minutes on that event, and then we'll go around and have a couple other people to give some time to. Leo?
Okay, thank you. My name is Leo Blanken. I'm from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. I came out at this issue from the direction of counterproliferation. So we've actually been doing counterproliferation work for a few years. And because of that work, we stumbled across the concept of emerging technologies, cyber, et cetera, the implications that that had for lowering the barriers to entry for proliferation. 2 years ago, we had a conference at NPS in a SCIF, top secret. So you can imagine the narrowness of the conversations that went on within there. So in the wake of that conference, we decided that our next conference, if we wanted to understand the implications of emerging technology on the proliferation issue, we needed to get out of the SCIF, which is the room where classified conversations take place. We needed to get off a military base. We needed to partner with some people to actually engage communities that are involved in emerging technologies. So we partnered with Stanford University's Hacking for Defense initiative and the DIUX initiative at Ames Field, et cetera, put on by Office of Secretary of Defense. Our goal was to get folks together talking about the issue of emerging technologies with the focus off of the technology and onto the communities in which these technologies emerge and diffuse and are embedded. And so we decided to look at this nexus of proliferation and emerging technology through 4 lenses: national security, regulation, for-profit industry, and communities. So cyber communities, do-it-yourself, maker communities, et cetera. We put on a conference at Stanford. We had voices from all 4 of those communities present and had 2 days very interesting conversations. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of themes that emerged from these conversations. One, once again, is that to us at least, people and communities were more important than the technologies, at least from our standpoint. Understanding the communities in which these technologies are innovated and diffused was incredibly important. Not only understanding incentives, so the Bug Bounty program is about incentives, but also understanding the norms and cultures of these communities. So instead of rewarding or threatening to punish someone for doing or not doing something, understanding what drives or motivates the folks that make up these communities. Another issue was not only the culture of those communities, but the culture of government, and in particular the regulatory agencies that engage these communities and their incentives. So instead of having regulatory agents that are rewarded for catching bad guys or not having something bad happen on their watch, also incentivizing them for actively engaging the communities that they're supposed to be watching over, getting to know those folks and what makes them tick, and actually have that be part of their MOP, measure of performance. Another big theme that has emerged, particularly from our interaction with DIUX on this issue, is there's part of the government that's interested in emerging technology as a potential threat, so causing proliferation issues, other pernicious things. There's another part of the government that's interested in how emerging technology can serve, let's say the military and become, new weapon systems, et cetera. And there seems to be a dividing line between those 2 lenses of looking at emerging technology. And a theme that emerged from our conference was, peeling back that division of labor and making more about understanding technology and community in general, rather than taking particular chunks of it and immediately classifying that as a threat or that as a potential widget or technology that might be built into force structure, but instead peeling back those frameworks and understanding the changing environment at a more fundamental level before you begin to take it, parse it out, and put it into your pre-existing frameworks. So those were some of the themes that emerged, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but I met Bo through this effort, so that was great, and I'll turn it back over to you, Bo.
Yeah, all right, thanks. And what I should have done before I handed it to Leo is introduce him, so I'll belatedly do that now and just talk a little bit about him. So Leo is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey. He's worked within the special operations communities as well as larger military bureaucracies, tackling the question, how do organizations respond when their strategic environment no longer matches their legacy modes of operation? And his current research, as he mentioned a little bit about it, explores the impact of agent incentives within the dynamics of force structure, planning, strategy, intelligence, and assessment of the emerging conflict. So now I want to hand the mic for a couple of minutes to Katie. I'll do a quick introduction. She is a hacker extraordinaire. She is probably the most prolific as well as the most well-respected person in the coordinated vulnerability disclosure community of the hacker space. And she is joining us here today very fortuitously. So Katie, why don't you say a few words about some of the things that you've done within the hacker community to help?
Sure, thanks, Bo. So I started out my career actually as a molecular biologist, so that had nothing to do with any of this world. But I learned how to hack when I was a teenager, and at that time there was no real way to make money doing that kind of activity. So I kind of put it aside, went to school for molecular biology and whatnot. And when I came back into computing, it was to defend networks around, the university where I was working. That caused me to have to brush off my hacking skills because I had to test my own defenses. And essentially, those of us who know how, this microphone is really sad, but those of us who know how to do penetration testing or hacking activities, but use those skills for good and for defense purposes, that is the kind of behavior that I've pretty much dedicated my career to encouraging. And so, working as a professional penetration tester, created some programs at Symantec and at Microsoft, Symantec Vulnerability Research, Microsoft Vulnerability Research, where we were essentially reporting vulnerabilities to other organizations when we found them, and writing the policies that dealt with how we would handle a vulnerability when it was reported to us as a vendor versus how we would handle a vulnerability that we ourselves found and were trying to report it to somebody else, and those multi-vendor vulnerability coordination efforts, things like Heartbleed, where you have to coordinate a single vulnerability among many service providers, was among some of the things that have been, something that I've been working on for the last, 15 years or so of my career. Now, what was interesting was that, when I was working at Microsoft as a security strategist, they had said, we will never pay for vulnerability information because they were getting a whole bunch of vulnerability reports for free from the hacker community. Basically, the people who cared about securing the internet were reporting those issues at a rate of, at least attempting to report issues, at a rate of about 200,000 non-spam email messages a year coming in to secure at Microsoft. So whenever somebody says to me that hackers need a cash incentive in order to, quote unquote, do the right thing, I will actually point them to the fact that Microsoft certainly wasn't poor. The research community knew that, and yet they were totally willing to help secure the internet ecosystem based on essentially just wanting to get those flaws that they found to be fixed. And so providing an easy mechanism by which researchers can come forward, hackers who want to help can come forward and not fear prosecution under certain, federal regulations like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, such that they can come forward without fear of prosecution and get these things fixed has been sort of this focus of my career. And then recently stepping into providing additional incentives. And that actually provides a way to do some of the focus of these already helpful security researcher hacker eyes and focus them on the areas that you actually want them to go looking for bugs. So the most interesting areas to an organization or a pilot program where they're experimenting with essentially engaging with this community and making sure that the machinery to fix the issues is well oiled on the back end. So that's kind of the crux of what, what my involvement in security research, vulnerability disclosure and coordination. I'm also an editor for the International Standards on Vulnerability Coordination. But this has been sort of the crux of my work over the last, dozen or so or 15 years of my career.
Okay. And now I'll hand it over to Jasmine. Jasmine El-Gamal is a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. As Dan mentioned, she focuses on the role of narratives in countering violent extremism, and she's also a Truman National Security Fellow. She previously served as the Special Assistant to Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as well as the Country Director for Syria and Lebanon at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Ms. El-Gamal served as an interpreter and cultural advisor to the U.S. military for a number of years, embedded with the 82nd Airborne Division, where she facilitated cooperation between U.S. troops in the local population in southern Iraq. Most recently, she served as director of photography for a documentary on the plight of Syrian refugees in Greece, and now she's here. So, Jasmine, why don't you give us a couple of minutes of your perspective on self-regulating communities?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have to say that I approached this issue. I wasn't really familiar with the term self-regulating communities, and so when Bo first reached out to me and talked about this, it was an unfamiliar term, but as he started explaining it to me, I realized that I had seen it myself. I had seen it in practice, and I understood some of the things that he was talking about, but maybe not in those exact technical terms or with the framework that you just discussed. So I think it's really helpful to hear the framework and then maybe just to tell you a little bit about my experience and how I felt like I saw this in action and some of the potential that can come out of that. So as Bo mentioned, I was recently in Greece. I was doing a documentary on the Syrian refugees in Greece, and I was located on the Greek-Macedonian border for about a week, a little over a week, but I was living at this refugee camp. And it was kind of a makeshift refugee camp. It wasn't an official one, but it was basically a little motel on the highway, 10 minutes away from the border of Macedonia, where a group of several hundred refugees had decided to pitch their tents on the parking lot of this hotel, and it became a refugee camp. And so that's where we were. And so I spent a few days there, and it very quickly occurred to me that, there was this entire ecosystem that just was created very naturally and very organically in response to this refugee crisis. And there were all different kinds of actors that I started to identify when I was talking to people. And I just wanted to share a little bit of, the scene and the characters that I came across, and then maybe try to tie it a little bit to what we're talking about and the potential of self-regulating communities getting together for positive purposes as opposed to negative purposes. So the proprietor of the hotel was this Greek citizen. He had been running this hotel on the side of the road for years, and all of a sudden, hundreds of refugees showed up in his parking lot, and what he decided to do was just open his doors to these people, and with no intervention or oversight from the Greek government, he decided to, he allowed them to stay in the parking lot, to use his facilities. He set up a water fountain that the refugees could go use because they had no other means of getting water or showering or anything like that. And so he kind of was like the overseer of the camp. And as I'm describing these characters to you, I think it would be helpful, and I would love to hear people who are more involved in, the things that you were talking about, trying to match, the description of the characters to the archetypes of, in these communities that you're talking about. So that was the proprietor of the hotel, and he kind of just made sure that nothing got out of hand and everything was going smoothly. And then there were the refugees themselves, who were just comprised several sub-communities. They were the Syrian and Iraqi refugees who were coming, escaping war, and they came in through Turkey, on those rubber rafts that you guys, I'm sure, have seen pictures of. And then you had also Afghans and Pakistanis and Somalis and North Africans, and they very quickly coalesced around their own communities. And had their own cultures and norms and their own reputations within the camp that I started to understand. And every one of these sub-communities, again, very naturally, with no oversight from government or from the Greek authorities that were lurking around the camps to make sure that nothing was getting out of hand, they elected their own leaders, and their own facilitators. And so it just so happened that the family that we ended up interviewing, that is the subject of our documentary, I don't know how they were able to just acquire cartons and cartons of cigarettes. And so they really became the hub of this entire camp. And just by virtue of them being the cigarette vendors, I'm sure you all know, like, cigarette smoking is everybody smokes over there. Among these communities. And so by virtue of him being the cigarette vendor, he got to hear tons of information and little snippets of information of what was going on in the camp. And so he had all this information and then could dole it out accordingly. If something was happening at this time, then people knew to go to him to see, what was happening. And so he was kind of like the communication center, if you will, of this refugee camp. And then there were the sort of nefarious characters in the camp too, who were just kind of lurking in the shadows and were very well known to the community, but the community did a very good job of protecting them from outsiders. And that was, to me, what was so fascinating, is how you could get an entire community to work towards a common goal, and whether that's a positive thing, like reporting something that was happening, or maybe not so positive thing to us, which is hiding the identities of these people. But for example, like, there was the smuggler in the camp, and the smuggler was in charge of rounding up groups of people at a time every night and taking them up to the border where they were crossing illegally every night, because by then the borders had been closed to refugees, all over Europe. And so everybody knew who the smuggler was. I knew that there was a smuggler, but you couldn't identify him. It was a very well-organized effort to keep this guy in the shadows. And then, most interestingly to me, because of my work on countering violent extremism and the role of communities in either de-radicalizing or identifying people who are radicalized in the community, there were several individuals who were completely radicalized. These were textbook cases of young men who were completely radicalized, either because of the views that they already had or because of the circumstances that they were, in. They're like stuck in this camp. They have no means of getting to another country and to a brighter future and all of this stuff. And so they became more and more radicalized. And they made no secret of their thoughts. They were talking about things that would concern any one of us sitting in this room. But again, the community, instead of deciding to report this individual, found it to be in their interest not to report the individual. And so there was a concerted effort to not isolate, but insulate these individuals and kind of protect them. Like, if they saw Greek authorities coming in, or if they saw even us as documentary filmmakers, they were very hesitant to tell us, like, this guy is saying this or this guy is saying this, whatever. We ended up finding out ourselves by talking to people and by explaining to them what we were doing, and that they didn't have to be afraid to tell us things. But it was just a very interesting thing to see. And the most interesting thing to me was how they communicated. And this is where sort of the technology aspect comes in. But I was really surprised. I don't know if you would be surprised to know that despite that these people had lost everything and just showed up to the camp with a backpack that they carried from Syria, and that was all they had left. They all had cell phones, and they all had WhatsApp, and that's how they communicated, both with people back home and with people who had made it to the other side. They were getting information about like where to go, like don't go through Serbia because they're really, doing this and that, and you should go here, and like I've reached Germany, so try to find this way to get to Germany. So. And then the same thing inside the camps when they were trying to figure out, like, if a new person came in and he wanted to make it clear that he wanted to be smuggled out as opposed to waiting for the government to come in and send them to government-run camps. He would very quickly go to the cigarette vendor, have a conversation with him, exchange numbers, and then that would be the way that they spoke to each other. So I think if we... just to close, I think I saw what you guys were talking about. I kind of saw it happen in front of me, not realizing that that's what it was. And I think what's interesting about this conversation is, what is the potential now? Like, if we understand the framework and if we understand the potential theoretically of what self-regulating communities can do, and then if we understand what is a self-regulating community, who are the actors, how does it happen, who decides who the leaders are and who decides what the decisions are and who makes those decisions, how can you merge those two things together and then add the technological means for them to do what is for the good of both the community and the society at large? How do you put all those pieces together and then move forward in a way that's constructive?
Yeah, thanks. That's very interesting to see you tie kind of the abstract theories that we're talking about that we may have seen, somewhere else. We're trying to build an abstraction of that, and then applying it to something completely different, right? Not technological communities of interest, but kind of cause-based communities of interest who are thrown together because of certain circumstances and must get along. It's kind of cool that these things might actually have a broader, wider implication that could even potentially help combat violent extremism. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a neat idea that some of this stuff could apply there too. So I want to start digging into it, and I want to go back to the Stanford event. And one of the things that I realized when I was sitting out there in the room was that governments move at a certain pace. It's just built into them. They should move at that certain pace, right? Maybe certain governments are a little faster, a little slower, but they're all within a certain spectrum. Corporations, same thing. Even startups have a certain latency to them. And both of those are slower moving than adversaries in the hacker space, right? So the bad guys move faster than either of those two institutions can move, and faster than it's desirable for them to move. And I was thinking, the only thing that actually moves faster than the bad guys is the good guys, the hackers, right? Or the biohackers, or the people who are really pushing the cutting edge just because they think it's cool and because they want to apply their knowledge, their experience to this area, and they've got a certain passion for it, right? So it started me wondering whether or not the only defense against these bad actors could be the good actors of the same type. And I'll start down with Leo. What are your thoughts on that observation? Does it make sense? Is it true? And then also, is that a compelling enough reason to want to stand up this some type of regime or program, or at least thought exercise to get people going in that direction?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. So building on your exact question and the things that Yasmin just spoke about, if you talk about groups, you talk about communities, there's a number of academic disciplines that look at these, and you talk to an anthropologist or a sociologist or a political scientist or an economist, they're all going to have disciplinary proclivities about how to slice that group up. I myself, I'm a political scientist with pretty rational choice, economistic background. So, I mean, when we would look at this question, we would say, gosh, you have to ask yourself a couple things, right? If you've got, let's say, a state apparatus and then a community sitting next to it, To what degree is the lack of cooperation that's going on amongst those groups right now, is that simply due to, is it what we call a coordination game, which means simply like they do have equilibria outcomes that they could fall on if they just somehow could be coordinated to do so. And that may just be exchange of information, right? Like, let's get on this equilibrium right here, and all we have to do is communicate to each other so we don't go to different places. There may be some distributional conflict, and that means they actually have divergent interests. And this is where I think things get a little more interesting. If they have completely divergent interests, there may be no room for cooperation. But if there's slightly divergent interests, now you're talking about a couple things. Could I pay that person to move to the equilibrium, to the outcome that I want them to be on? Could I threaten to punish them? Could I help either tap into or foster existing norms that these other communities have to find some mutually agreeable outcome? I think these are so in wrapping all that up into a response to your question, it's definitely worth exploring, because at least one big takeaway from the conference that we had was that the intangible technology transfer that's occurring through the medium of the internet is simply moving beyond traditional regulatory efforts of interdiction of things and people moving across borders. It's simply being outpaced. So what you're talking about is something that I think needs to be part of the conversation as a novel way of crafting new policy.
Charlie, Katie, Jasmine, any thoughts?
I would just say, from the government's perspective, I personally I believe that the good guys outnumber the bad guys in cyberspace. What I think we could have done, what I think the government could do a better job of is, it's one thing to be a good guy and to, try to do right by the internet, but we haven't given, the hacker community a lot of reasons to necessarily want to help us. So I think as we can be more open and more transparent and welcoming of their profession, which you can look at historically hasn't been our strong suit. I think these communities can certainly self-regulate, but I think we could do a better job of not necessarily providing incentives, but just creating an environment where they can self-regulate in a way that more specifically actually helps government and national security.
Yeah, almost like Katie was saying earlier, providing that conduit where, hey, we won't sue you. Right. And that might be enough of an enticement. In some cases, when companies start bug bounty programs or coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs, they get reports faster than it would be possible to find the bugs, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that people already knew about these things. It's just the companies who could fix them didn't know because the preconditions that they had set were hostile to that. Yeah. Katie?
So I don't think this microphone really works, but I often hear this discussion break down into this very polar discussion: good guys, bad guys, white hats, black hats. Where this model breaks down for me is that no human being, and hackers are still human as far as we know, no human being is actually codified as pure black hat or pure white hat, good guy or bad guy. And if you think about it in terms of every bug represents a decision. So just like every yellow light that you encounter represents a decision for you. Do you gun it and go for it, or do you stop? And essentially, bug hunting works a lot the same way. There are certainly members of this population that will act in one way at all times. They will, no matter what, they will try, to either turn it over to the people responsible for fixing the issue, and they will always act that way. And there are some who will never do that. They will keep the vulnerability. They will try and exploit the vulnerability or sell the vulnerability. There are some who fall into those polarized categories. But when I hear these discussions about shifting norms, only talking about these polar extremes, to me, it just represents a misunderstanding of all of the nuance in that kind of yellow light decision moment that every single bug discovery represents. So when I look at it as a population, a community, not only is this community shifting, the average age of a hacker who is very prolific is quite a bit under the age where your judgment centers have fully developed in your brain. So can you imagine all of these relatively young, under 25 years old individuals who are faced with this yellow light decision time and time again every time they find a bug? When I think about shifting the norms of behaviors of this population, I think about it in terms of how do we actually make it super easy for them to take that pause that we want them to take and turn it over to the folks who can defend. And the last thought that I'll say, that I've used this as an illustration before, is that many people in this room remember when getting digital music was something that you had to do kind of on the sly and maybe not so legally. And then Apple iTunes came along and made it 99 cents, click, easy. Everybody gets paid, everybody gets what they want. You know, the content creators are no longer being ripped off. And suddenly, the entire population pretty much shifts to doing the easy button, which is, you know, just click the thing and do the right thing. So when I think about these populations, one, I don't think of them as polarized as much as everyone wants them to be. You know, the Lone Ranger versus the other guy, I guess, the guy in black. But I think of it in terms of shifting the norms of behaviors over time when you're working with a generation of people who are, you know, the coming into this population starts when you're a child. I started hacking things when I was a child. How do you explain to a child what the rights and wrongs are of this type of behavior, especially when we've got a lot of legislation that makes it confusing for grown adults to know where the boundaries are? So that's I think, you know, something that we should take into consideration. Non-polarized population, not really polarizing to the extremes as much as we'd like to characterize it that way. And two, just provide those easy buttons to help them, you know, along to make the choices that we would like them to make for defense.
Yeah.
Also, if I can just add one
Please.
thing, just from again the perspective, you know, the like sort of CVE, you know, refugee crisis perspective, the government does move a lot slower than events, it seems, and that's, you know, not always necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way things are. I mean, governments aren't necessarily built to move with the speed of light, and there's a reason for that, you know. But there's also no reason why we shouldn't, as governments, only try to affect or utilize communities that are already existing. Like, okay, the hacker community, like they're already hackers. Like, let's try to shift them and use them. And what about like the thousands upon millions of refugees who are languishing in refugee camps, who are itching for something to do and for something to learn, and who are young and impressionable, and their minds are just, you know, I mean, at one point I remember we were sitting in this camp, and we had our MacBook, and we were like editing some of the video that we did, and the director locked her computer. And this little 5-year-old kid, who's the subject of our documentary, he was sitting at the computer, and he just went like tick, 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 and all of a sudden it was unlocked. And we just looked at him, and we were like, how'd you do that? And so there's so much potential. And I know that, you know, and I think in a sense, like here in Washington or in policy communities, we tend to really silo ourselves into, okay, this is the technology group, and this is the refugee group, and this is the CVE group. But like, these are all so connected. These issues are so incredibly connected, and there are so many opportunities across the board that I think that as governments, we shouldn't necessarily be thinking, how do we become faster, but how do we identify people and invest in people that could eventually help us multiply whatever capabilities we already have and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, because you're right. I mean, if we have a latent talent pool that is going unused, to be able to turn that latent talent into kinetic talent and have them doing something very productive, you know, number one, it gives them an outlet for the desires that they already have. Mm-hmm. Right? Number two, it gets you more of a trusted broker. You know, all of a sudden you become friends with the cigarette seller and he tells
Exactly.
you know, this is what's going on. You build that trust relationship within those communities in a way that you can't do even just by showing up, right? In some cases, showing up and learning what motivates people helps a great deal, but in other cases, you know, you can go way beyond that if somebody can use some of their resources, and I'm thinking like, you know, old outdated computers that we would normally, you know, junk or recycle, taking some of those and getting them into the hands of people who really want to learn, really want to have these capabilities, could be an amazing force to start building the communities almost from scratch. And then you've got a new group that you can go and invest in intellectually to turn them into you know, powers for good rather than protecting the bad actors. And Katie, to your point about there's people on one side, people on the other side, maybe that's 1% on the other side who's, you know, never going to change their minds. Everybody else in the middle reacts to how others treat them, right? So if you're a government, you have the power based on your actions to turn people into white hats or into black hats. Just depends on how you want to do it. I made a similar observation out at Stanford, and somebody later leaned over and said, "Yeah, that's just classical counterinsurgency theory." You didn't know that? It's like, no, we didn't. We had to learn all of this stuff from scratch. So I wonder to what degree we can carry over some of the lessons that we're learning in these types of conversations we're having, whether it's counterproliferation, countering violent extremism, counterinsurgency, hacking, and teach each other, because you're right, it is all connected. And the better we can make things connect and learn from each other at this level, the better that we can actually engage some of the communities of interest. So I don't know if anybody is versed in countering insurgency on the panel. I'm looking to the military folks now. But you know, is that the case, that that's a classic counterinsurgency theory?
I mean, I think an important thing here, so the Self-Regulating Communities Conference, the idea for it came up because of two people, two students that we had at the Naval Postgraduate School. One is Major Jen Snow, who's an Air Force officer who wrote this great thesis on emerging technologies. The other one was this great, who's a Army Special Forces major, who's now, he's off doing stuff. And we had a beer one night, and he was reading her thesis, and he said, well, this is what we do, right? This is what Special Forces are trained to do. Go somewhere and mobilize a population, get them moving in the direction you want them to move into. The important thing is you don't lie to them. You don't manipulate them, right? What you do is you talk to them to the degree, you talk to them enough so you understand mutual benefit, right? And then you're just illuminating things. You're not necessarily, you don't have to engage in a propaganda campaign or lie to these folks, because they're going to quickly figure out that you're lying to them, and then you've burned that bridge. So as long as it takes, you know, you move slowly, you move thoughtfully, and you really, if you can't find any mutual benefit, then you're kind of out of luck, but don't lie to them. And I think that is something that really resonated throughout the SRC conference as well.
Yeah, and I think it was a workshop, not a conference.
Oh, yes, sorry, it was a workshop.
Falls into a different, apparently, some type of a government thing where you can't go to conferences, but you can go to workshops.
DOD hates conferences.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So at this point, I think we're going to open the floor to questions. And again, if you're online, #ACCyber, tweet your question to us, and we'll try and get to it. So based on the conversations that we've had, and we could keep going talking amongst ourselves all night long, but we know that there's going to be a lot of people who have questions for the esteemed panelists here. So why don't we start out? I think we got one right there. And just say who you are and who you represent, if you don't mind.
Awesome, for sure. My name is Sydney Franklin. I'm a summer intern open source intelligence analyst for Reliance Incorporated, and we're a nonprofit that works to combat human trafficking in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So a tad bit unrelated, but I'm a national security law major, so I'm like super interested in like the topic today. This question is for Jasmine, and it may be pushing the issue too far, but I think your comment about tapping into latent talent and encouraging those individuals to learn this field of hacking, and or for the government to tap into that and train these individuals and use them to our advantage. I think that's very interesting. Just out of curiosity, what do you think that would look like in terms of how that might be created? Where would we go to seek these individuals? Just out of curiosity, if you've thought about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've definitely thought about it. This was my second visit to a refugee camp. My first one was last year. I went to the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, which is it's a very large, I think one of the largest refugee camps, and it's actually co-run by the government of Jordan, which it's unique in that sense. And we had a little round table, I guess I would just, conversation with a group of youth in the camp who were like the mentors of the younger. They had volunteered to be mentors to younger kids in the camp, and we were just talking to them about, what is it that you're missing? What do you want to do? And it really just blew my mind how much education and opportunity was just the thing that they wanted. Because I mean, you think about us here in school, like we get a snow day and we're like, yes, we don't have to go to school, this is awesome. But these kids were dying to go to school, they wanted to learn. And one thing that that really just stuck with me, that I've just been telling everybody whenever I talk about this topic, is this one kid who was about 17, 18, he said, these are Syrian refugees, and he basically said, it's really not fair, because you're going to expect us, like my generation, 5 years from now, when the war is over, 10 years from now, we live in refugee camps. You're going to expect us to go back to Syria and rebuild our country. With what? Like, with what tools? We will have been in this camp for 10 years. We barely have any computers. All of the the science majors, the people who are doctors, people who need to practice with their hands, they're just sitting there. They're not doing anything. And so it just, that's the opportunity. I mean, why aren't we providing computers and classrooms and then speaking? I mean, we have technology. Like, why aren't we doing, why aren't we creating programs in high schools in the U.S. where you get extra credit if you get on Skype twice a week and mentor a Syrian refugee and speak to them in English? Just something as simple as that. And so there was just this constant need for, like, give us something to do. And again, these kids are bright. They all have cell phones. They're all like very technologically savvy to the extent that they can be. And it's just a huge missed opportunity. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I agree. All right, here's a question from Twitter, which is, Jasmine, in the camp you mentioned that there was a cigarette guy who acted kind of as a trusted broker for information and passing things on, and anytime someone got something from him, I'm imagining, he would be trusted. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what structure exists like the trusted broker, the cigarette salesman, in the cyber community to allow companies or others to kind of bridge, and maybe it's not for vulnerabilities, maybe it's for threats, maybe it's for some of the other information and some of the other capabilities that hackers have that governments need and corporations need to protect themselves. Is there a similar type of structure? Is it desirous to build a structure like that? What are your thoughts?
Okay. I think, one, there are entities that will trade that information, but they are doing it for hire, right? So it's not necessarily a trust brokering, but it's actually a paid-for service. I think that in terms of having the ability to have some of these trusted entities going between organizations and governments and the hacker community, a lot of that depends on whether or not the hackers feel like that organization will actually protect their anonymity if it came down to it. And one of the things that CertCC in the United States does, it will occasionally coordinate vulnerabilities between a hacker who wishes to remain anonymous to the vendors, because maybe they came upon that information in a questionable way. Maybe they actually ran afoul of some federal laws in finding out about those things. And so the ability to create those, and that organization, while it's wonderful, it only has limited capacity to serve in this kind of way as a liaison between the community and the defenders. So it can only act in that capacity when absolutely necessary and for protecting essentially critical infrastructure type of issues. So other than that, you basically have this issue where these for-pay services are the ones that are taking up this mantle, and they'll essentially acquire vulnerability information or threat information, and they will resell it to folks who need that information. Yeah. The other bits where this goes on is these are more, especially for threat intelligence stuff, this is more establishing trusted relationships between the individuals in this community who happen to work at major vendors. So you'll actually see threat intel sharing happen among people who have met in person. They have established their trust relationships, either over a beer or maybe some karaoke. And they have essentially established this rapport where they feel like if I give this information to this person at this other organization or this government, that I will not get burned for doing so. And they've established that, kind of one-on-one type of trust relationships. So I don't know if that answers your question about it, but that's typically, I think, how it's working right now.
Yeah, I think that it's an answer in my mind, but it's not the answer I would want to have, which is, yes, there is a trusted broker in this ecosystem. And I wonder, like the cigarette salesman, if there isn't some entity who could play that role, such as somebody that everyone goes to already, such as like insurance. Could insurance be some type of a harbor of this information? And I don't know, maybe not, but at least it's a thought. How could we build those archetypes within the cyber community? Or how could we recognize and emerge those archetypes like you've observed in other communities?
Though I would say, absent one kind of trusted central point of contact, it's perhaps equally beneficial or as important in lieu of that there's just kind of an overall trusted environment. That from a legal and policy, but also just kind of past practice and proving as each new company becomes welcoming of this type of behavior. I think a central entity would be very useful, but it's also great that more and more companies, more sections of society, the government now is saying you can come straight to us with what you found, and we'll treat it in a way that is consistent with the way that people have done it in the past. And have learned from those experiences.
Okay. I think I definitely want to echo what you guys said, because I think the word trust is the key word here. And I think, the cigarette seller, he was trusted because he's part of that community, and they know that not only is he protecting their information, but he's also providing them information that they don't have. So it's like a mutually beneficial relationship, but it's also encased in trust. I think the FBI is and U.S. law enforcement and law enforcement in general in Europe is sort of grappling with that issue, with that exact issue when it comes to the relationship with Muslim communities all across Europe as they try to counter the ISIS threat and as they try to counter extremism. I think they've gotten to the right place, which is that this lies with the communities. This does not lie with us. Like, the communities have to be the ones to self-regulate and self-report and do all that stuff. But how do you create a relationship with law enforcement where the communities actually want to work together with them and see them as a trusted agent and see them as someone with whom they have a mutually beneficial relationship? So I don't think they have the answer to that yet. I think it's good that they've at least asked that question of themselves. But again, it just comes down to trust, I think.
Yeah, and Leo, I think when we were in Stanford, we heard an example in the biohacking community. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
The iGEM. Yeah, so there's a Dr. Megan Palmer at Stanford helps with a program called iGEM, in which it's a venue in which do-it-yourself. Imagine, I think it's like your high school science fair, you do these do-it-yourself hobbyist bio people come together and don't really compete but share their projects with each other, and this has been a venue for the FBI to they participate and help work with this project so that they're engaging with this community in a manner which allows them to know what's going on in terms of DIY bio, but also allows them to build relationships and trust with that community. And I think that will pay dividends in the long run as they begin to personally know a lot of these folks. So, I mean, this is I think there's a number of models out there: the confidential informant type model, the large-scale engagement model. You know, there's one of my students right now is writing a thesis where he's doing a case study of Poland, who's actually playing with some sort of a National Guard militia model to actually bring in folks who have particular cyber skills but maybe don't want to join the military. And that could be a vetting process to allow some of that capacity to be drawn from the private sector into serving national security, but not putting these folks in uniform 365 days a year. So I think maybe some combination of all these approaches might pay big dividends.
That's really interesting, and I know in the biohacking community, the FBI had some early missteps where they arrested a couple of people out in California who were doing innocuous things, but had maybe anti-government leanings. So they came in and interpreted the data in a certain way that was not accurate. But to an FBI agent who's tasked with maybe today fighting cybercrime and tomorrow biohacking, you know, they don't know the difference. So this was, I think, a very clueful response by the FBI to go in and build and establish relationships in those communities. I know that something similar has happened maybe in the opposite way with the FBI and the hacker communities. In the 90s, they went in and engaged groups like Loft and talked with them in a more friendly and open manner to figure out what they were doing, how they were staying ahead of the curve. And if you look today, maybe they're repeating some of the mistakes that they made in the biohacking community by coming down too hard on some of the security researchers or hackers, computer hackers, who are doing things that might be interpreted through a certain lens as bad actor actions, but actually might be completely innocuous, and in a lot of cases are innocuous. So I want to go back for another question here, and then we'll go for another question on Twitter. Yes, you first.
Hi, my name is Simone. I'm with American University, a student there currently. The conversation is very interesting to me, and it sounds, if I'm interpreting this correctly, it sounds like we want to allow a means for the self-regulating communities to be able to do the right thing. I especially, Katie, like your analogy with the iTunes. It very sticks very well. But my question is actually for you, Charlie, in terms of what is the government doing to be able to sustain this? Because I can only imagine with the program you just mentioned that the secretary just closed it down. So you found certain vulnerabilities, and once you fix those, I mean, technology just continuously advances. So there's only the assumption that there will be future vulnerabilities. So my question is, what is being done to sustain the ability to continuously look and maintain upkeep? And then a part two to that is, how are we measuring success?
That's a great question, Simone. So specific to the issues, you know, the specific program I talked about in my remarks, you know, we are very interested in, you know, expanding the use of those types of techniques, whether that's you know, a global bug bounty where anyone can play, or something more targeted and tailored for different types of assets. So, you know, DoD will use, you know, these techniques more. We're also very interested in, you know, sharing that with the rest of the government. And you know, with international, you know, partners, with you know, other national governments as well. But I think more, you know, on a broader level, where, you know, the best way to stay ahead of the curve, and it's kind of the topic of what we're talking here, is to, you know, not hold these communities which have this talent and which have, you know, all different types of people in it, not hold them at arm's length. Hold them a little bit closer, get to know them better. Get to know the players and the people who, you know, want to help versus, you know, people we're more concerned about, and try to, you know, build a closer relationship there. And I think you are right. There will always be more vulnerabilities, and technology will keep advancing. The government tends to be a little bit behind the curve in terms of technology. These days we're in a very different environment than we were when the Department of Defense was created. And just the very best thing we can do is stay tied in with the community that's on the cutting edge, whether that's computer hackers or biohackers, what have you. And by we're doing our part to try to improve the culture and kind of the headline about government and hackers. Are they at odds? Are they working closer together? But we need to really sustain that momentum to really fully change that narrative.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because you had a question about how do you measure success in these types of programs. So unless you wanted to take it, I was going to, okay. So as you pointed out, and as we're all in agreement, there will always be more vulnerabilities to be found, and especially as technology changes. So one of the things that's really important to establish is essentially your baseline against which you are going to measure. And then you're not necessarily looking for a decrease in the numbers of vulnerabilities found or reported. That could be one way to measure. However, it's overly simplistic. Ideally, you want to measure the complexity of the vulnerabilities that are being found. So over time, that low-hanging fruit layer should start to dry up. And while you may stay steady with the number of vulnerabilities, as you're engaging with the hacker community and more skilled hackers are kind of coming out of the woodwork saying, you know what, this isn't your usual cross-site scripting. Actually, this is kind of an interesting problem. I'm interested in hacking this and solving this problem, that they will come up with more and more complex issues for you to digest and for you to correct. So baseline, number one, you can do a primitive measurement of number of vulnerabilities found, but vulnerability count is not actually the best measure of continued improvements in security, if that helps answer your question. Yeah.
So we'll take one from Twitter, and then we'll go out to the audience. So a question from Twitter is, isn't the problem not just good guys versus bad guys, that is white hat hackers versus black hat hackers, and kind of a race to see who can find things first? But isn't it also the target population, the community of people who make up the potential victims, right? The software makers, the Internet of Things device makers, the people who may take a poorly secured device and put it on the internet, whether it's inherently poorly secured or whether they make choices that lead to a poor secure. So what is the role of that victim or target community versus just the white hats versus the black hats? And to extend on the question a little bit, one of the observations that I made in the Stanford event is that you had several very distinct stakeholder groups who would not normally be in the same room together. And I wonder what the role is of all those stakeholder groups, whether it's at events and conferences, getting white hats. Maybe you can't get black hats in the room, but people who act as substitutes for black hats, and then potentially victim organizations or those who would be targets of cybercrime or some other type of attack. Is that a useful model, or how does the role of the potential target play into all of this?
I'll just speak for myself. One of the other efforts that the Secretary announced that we're very interested in looking at is updating the way we buy these technologies and ensuring that when we are purchasing or contracting with companies to develop and deploy software for us, that we can have kind of the transparency and data rights built in, so we can see what we're getting. And ultimately, so we can do more things like bug bounties and things like that to make sure that it's really secure. And so we do very much have kind of the software makers in mind. More, I think more like across the industry and society. I just think as we as these activities continue and gain steam, industry is already I would argue raising their game. But the threats are advancing as well. And that's why, I'll just get back to the point I made in the previous question. That's why I think it's really important to have those tight ties with the community to ensure that you're kind of staying ahead of that threat.
Any other thoughts? Leo?
This builds on to what Charlie actually mentioned before in answering your question, Bo, is when I think of victims like not being cyber hacked, remember why we originally came at this problem was because of proliferation. So think of the bad hats as not trying to hack the Pentagon, but instead contributing to intangible technology flows that will lead to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Charlie mentioned before that DoD and in fact our entire national security apparatus was designed in 1947, and it was purpose-built for the Cold War environment and did really well at that. It created this elaborate division of labor that matched really well the contest with the Soviet Union. So if the Soviets built a new bomber, hey, Air Force built a new bomber, and it was very compartmentalized. And cyber is leading to threats or vulnerabilities that bleed across authorities and bleed across bureaucracies. And so for us, it was simply not just understanding the space that the cyber people, potential black hats or gray hats or white hats or whatever you want to call them, but also understanding the changing realities of the blue space, the USG, and how it was important for us to have folks from Commerce, FBI, but also SOCOM, et cetera, in the same room as part of that potential, panoply of potential victims who need to coordinate and understand each other. Because once again, sometimes it's not about understanding the hackers, it's understanding your interagency partner, who you trust probably just as little as a black hat hacker. So.
Yeah. All right, we've got about 5 more minutes left, so I want to get more questions.
Hi, thanks. Jackson Webster. I'm an intern at CRS this summer and coming from King's College London Department of War Studies originally. Speaking from that kind of, I guess, European perspective of things, a lot of the debate over there that goes on is how the private sector has really grasped in Europe the idea of hiring generalists, hiring people that are like fairly good at a lot of things, but not necessarily particularly trained in one thing, and that way you can recognize the sort of cross-cutting vulnerabilities or opportunities that you guys discussed earlier. Governments, and particularly the American government, is not necessarily as good at that. There's a lot of tracking and specialization that goes on, particularly in the public sector. And I guess my question would be: is there any way is this just kind of the nature of the beast with government, or is there any way that the government could potentially adapt, especially looking at like what's going on with like the NDAA reform and everything that's being pushed through right now? Like there is a move to change the DoD to better confront complex threats. Is there any way to hire the sorts of people that you see going to work for, like startups and stuff, to work for the government to do the same sort of thing? Thanks.
Looking at the government person?
Looking at you.
Yeah.
Everybody looks at Charlie.
All I can think
Well,
is hiring freeze.
Sure. So I'm very, I'm familiar with NDAA reform and creating cross-functional teams. I think there's a lot of inherent value in that. I'll kind of defer my personal opinion and just kind of lean on the Secretary of Defense and some of the initiatives that he's really interested in pushing. He has a Future of the Force initiative that is all about building permeability. So this doesn't get right to having cross-functional generalists in government, but it's about being able to flow people to and from government much easier than is currently the case. So we will send officers out on sabbatical and go work in Silicon Valley or for another corporation. Find ways to bring people from Silicon Valley and Houston and Boston into the Pentagon for a rotation. So it's not necessarily building generalists, but it's sharing perspectives and creating that environment where you're getting lots of diverse perspectives and backgrounds and experience in the building. And I think that's a tremendously valuable kind of goal to strive for.
All right.
Nick Leiserson with the Office of Congressman Lanchvin. I want to talk about trust, which has been one of the underlying themes here, and particularly trust resilience, because it's one thing if I trust you enough to share information, but what I'm really interested in, and what my boss is really interested in, is building that level so that when we share information and something wrong happens, that you still trust that, look, that was a mistake, and we can go on and not retreat into our corners. And one of the reasons I think that government tends to move slowly in this space with new communities is that when they make a mistake, which they will do, just like there will be hackers out there that do things that are really, really bad and that, should be prosecuted or should be whatever else and give the hacking community a bad name, government will make those same mistakes. How do we build that resilience, and how do we try and create an environment where we're not just impugning the motives whenever one of the sides, government or the community, makes a mistake?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and maybe I'll take first stab at answering it and then throw it to others. I think you have to build enduring trust by building real enduring relationships. I think in the US, especially in the commercial space, we have a tendency towards transactional relationships. And especially if you look at like government procurement, it's a very transactional relationship. Everything has to go out to bid. If you treat some of these types of topics as a transactional relationship, I'm going to go out here for a workshop, not a conference, for a week, and all of a sudden these people are going to trust me, and then any information they give me, I'm going to take back and we're going to act on it. Then that really, there is no resilience there, right? It comes from being completely embedded in a community, I think, to where their hopes, dreams, and aspirations are not things that you can write down on a piece of paper and understand in your rubric of decision making, but they're things that you internalize and you start to feel. So one example of that is one of the reasons the FBI is doing so well in the biohacking community is they hired a biohacker to run that outreach program. And he really came from that space and is lending his expertise in the FBI as well as lending his credibility of the FBI into these biohacking spaces. So I think it's got to be entrenched, internalized, and that buys you that a little bit of forgiveness. And if I'm extrapolating a little bit, it's an oversimplification to say that Americans are worse or more transactional in their relationships than other countries. But if you look in places where Jasmine often goes, they do tend to be much more relationship driven. Everything cycles around the relationship, and that trust building exercise that you go through is a part of building a relationship and becoming friends and ensconcing yourself in that community. So I think that in some cases maybe we could learn from what goes on in the rest of the world and be a little bit better at building those enduring trust relationships out of that. So anybody else want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of theoretical literature on this in terms, and a lot of it has to do with repeated interactions. One thing that we've learned that is the problem, the way, just like the DoD at least, or the military, the way it apportions and moves around human talent, right? Like literally moves people from job to job so quickly. In one respect, creates these very well-rounded individuals, but in another respect, I think a downside of it is the inability to form long-term relationships. If you're always there, and then this chair is occupied by a different dude every 2 years, that's difficult to build that personal, in-depth relationship. So there are some manipulable things that I think we could tweak to build more enduring relationships in certain environments.
I mean, I'm still on WhatsApp with the cigarette seller. Like, we still talk all the time. And he tells me what's going on in the camp, and that we didn't just go make the movie and then leave and disappear forever. So if I can do that, then governments should be able to do that as well. Not maybe on WhatsApp, but in general.
Yeah. Well, I think that's maybe a great last word to end the formal conversation. And we'll continue in the lobby with some wine and cheese. We'll be around for a little while longer if you've got other questions, you want to come pick our brains. And on the recorded video, keep tweeting at AC Cyber or hashtag AC Cyber, and we can keep the dialogue going to build enduring relationships. So thank you very much.